Day of Chodesh Mar Cheshvan, and we are learning the very beginning, Daf Nun Ches Amud Aleph, the beginning of Tamid Nishchat, the fifth parak of Maseches Pesachim. This is the beginning of five parakim talking about the Korban Pesach. Now, while that does sound like it is not Negeh Halacha L'Maisa to our days in Galus, which Be'ez Hashem should be a Halacha L'Maisa. All the halachas of Korban Pesach should be halacha l'maisa this year. But as we will see already from the beginning, there are many halachas that are very much negah halacha l'maisa that come out of these prakim, and therefore the Mishnah begins with Tamid Nishchat, that the Korban Tamid is shachted b'shmeina u'mechza at the 8.5 hour, meaning on a 6 to 6 day. There are 12 hours in the day. Beginning of the day is at 6 a.m. and the end of the day is at 6 p.m. And the Korban Tamid, obviously the afternoon Korban Tamid, will be shechted at 8.5 hours into the day. V'karev, and it is brought, meaning the process begins at the 8.5 hour, and it is brought betisha u'mechza at 9.5 hours into the day, which would be 3:30 on a 3:30 p.m. on a 66 day. But on the Erevs of Pesach, Nishchat b'sheva mechza, it is shechted at the 7.5 hour, v'kar b'shmona mechza, and it is brought on the Mizbech the 8.5 hour, bein b'chol, bein b'Shabbos, whether it be on a weekday or on Shabbos. Chal Erev Pesach liyas be'erev Shabbos, but on the occasion that Erev Pesach was Chaliyas be'erev Shabbos, that you had an Erev Pesach fell out on an Erev Shabbos, Nishchat b'sheish u'mechza. That's when it was shechted at 6.5 hours into the day, meaning at 12:30. V'karev b'sheva mechza, and it was brought at 7.5 hours of the day, 1:30. Pesach achrav, and then the Korban Pesach was brought thereafter. Says the Gemara as follows: Mina hanimiri. Where does this come from? Where does what come from? That the Tamid is Nishchat b'shmeina mechza v'kara b'tisha mechza. How do you know that? Amr b'Shub Levi says b'Shub Levi the Amr Kra. It is a pasuk in the Torah. Pasuk says, "Esakevus echad taseh b'boker v'esakevus hasheni taseh bein ha'arbaim." The first Korban Tamid, the one that is brought in the morning, is brought in the morning. V'esakevus hasheni, and the second Korban Tamid, ta'aseh, you're going to do bein ha'arbaim, between the evenings. What does between the evenings mean? Says Rabbi Shimon Levi, chalkeo lebein shnei arbaim. You have to divide up the afternoon into two afternoons, meaning two arbaim. Beis shas mechza lekan, which would be 2.5 hours in one direction. Shtei shas mechza lekan, and 2.5 hours in another direction. V'sha achas la'asiyasai, and 1 hour to make it, meaning 6 hours there are in the afternoon, and with those 6 hours, you're going to divide those 6 hours in twine, and that's going to be 2.5 hours on one end, 2.5 hours on the other end, and an hour in the middle. That's what you're going to work out with. You're going to be making and bring the current Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim in by 9.5 hours into the afternoon. Massive Rava disagrees. Hold on a second. But the Mishnah also tells us that the Korban Tamid is brought on Erev Pesach. The Korban Tamid was shechted an hour earlier. Instead of it being shechted at 8.5 hours, it is shechted at 7.5 hours. And it is brought at 8.5 hours. Bein b'chol bein Shabbos, whether it be on a weekday or on Shabbos. And if you think that shechting it at 8.5 hours is a din da'araisa because the pasuk says, how would you ever be allowed to bring it earlier on Erev Pesach? Rather, Rava tells us as follows: Mitzvah de tamid mi sheyinatu tzlale erev. That the mitzvah of bringing the Korban Pesach, the Korban Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim, is when the shadows of the evening begin to elongate, meaning they start to happen. The shadows get longer and longer as the day goes by. but they begin shortly after midday. My timer. What's the reason? The Amar the pasuk says, "Bein ha'arbaim," between the evenings. Me'idna de maschil shimshcha le mi'arav. From the beginning, from the time that the sun begins to turn towards the west. Hilkach b'shayim ha'shana. Therefore, during the rest of the year, the ikin adarim and the that there are many korbanos, that there are personal korbanos that a person has to bring. They bring them to the base. I mean, this the Rachmana Amud the Torah says about them. Aleh chalve hashlamim, that the second korban atamid is aleh chalve hashlamim. On it will burn all of the chalve hashlamim, the fat of all of the shlamim, the sacrifices that are brought, the personal sacrifices that a person brings the whole day. V'amamar, and the master had told us, one of the Amoraim says, what does that mean? Aleh hashleim kol korbanos kulam. That means that on the korban tamid shel bein ha'arbaim, no other additional korbanos were brought. Once you brought the korban tamid shel bein ha'arbaim, that was the end of the day in the Beis Hamikdash. So all of the later, all of the korbanos that you wanted to bring had to be brought between the two korban tamids. Because there's lots of korbanos that you need to bring during the day, so people had lots to do. So they would push off the korban tamid bein ha'arbaim until 8.5 hours. They would shecht at 8.5 hours, and they would bring it at 9.5 hours. But on Erev Pesach, the Ika Pesach Achrav. But Erev Pesach is different. On Erev Pesach, you start to bring the korban Pesach afterwards. That's the only korban that's ever offered after the korban tamid. You bring it early by 1 hour, and you shecht it at 7.5 hours. Chal Erev Pesach, there's the Erev Shabbos. But if Erev Pesach fell out on an Erev Shabbos, that you also have to roast the whole korban Pesach. Everybody's got to have time to roast the entirety of the korban Pesach before Shabbos starts. The Lodachi Shabbos, because roasting the korban Pesach is not a mitzvah that would push off Shabbos. That's when we have it at the earliest possible time, la'alacha. The earliest possible time, la'alacha, to have the korban Pesach would be 6.5 hours. That's when you would be able to start shechting it. That is halacha l'maisa with regards to when we can start davening mincha, which is 6.5 hours in the day. Mishi yinotu tzlale erev. Tanu Rabbanan, the Brisa says as follows: Kisidur b'chol kach sidur b'Shabbos. The way that it was ordered, meaning the timing of it on a weekday, is the same. Kach sidur b'Shabbos is the same as the same that they would do it on a Shabbos. Div Rabbi Yishmael, that is the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva says Kisidur b'Erev Pesach, the same way that it was done on Erev Pesach. That's what does that mean? So Kisidur b'chol kach sidur b'Shabbos or kach sidur b'Erev Pesach. That is the machlokes. My comment, what exactly is going on? What is this discussion? Amar Abaye says, this is what we are saying. Kisidur b'chol, the same way that it was done, b'chol b'Erev Pesach, during a weekday on Erev Pesach, meaning that it was shechted at 7.5 hours, brought to 8.5. Kach sidur b'Shabbos b'Erev Pesach. That's the same way that they would do it on a Shabbos that was Erev Pesach, meaning Shabbos Erev Pesach. They would shecht it at 7.5 hours and bring it at 8.5 hours. Div Rabbi Yishmael, that's the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva says, no, because you do it Erev Pesach, shechali is Erev Shabbos. The same way that it was done on Erev Pesach, they did it on Erev Shabbos. 6.5, 7.5. Kach sidur Shabbos, that's how they would do it on Shabbos as well. Umas nisin diktani bein b'chol bein Shabbos, Rabbi Yishmael. And the mission that says that this that says the way that it was brought on a chol on a weekday is the way that it was brought on Shabbos is the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael. What are they arguing about? They are debating whether the musaf was brought before the bazichin, that was the incense. Rabbi Yishmael holds musafin, that the korban musaf kadmin lebazichin was brought before the bazichin, before the incense that was brought together around the same time as the korban musaf, that was connected to the lechem apanim. And you would bring the korban musaf at 6 hours in the day, and the incense at the 7th hour of the day. And then you would bring the korban tamid at 7.5 hours. That's when they would start shechting it. Rabbi Akiva Savar, Rabbi Akiva holds, no, the incense came before the Musaf. You bring the incense at 5 hours into the day, that would be 11 a.m. And then by noon, you brought the Karban Musaf. And then you brought the Karban Tamid at 6.5 hours of the day. And Rava is then going to disagree strongly with Abaye. We will continue with that disagreement tomorrow morning. Everybody should have a wonderful day.